Shalom, welcome back. We are continuing on with this search and this journey to better understand the formation of the religion of the Hebrews, however you want to term that, whether the Mosaic faith or the Sinai covenant or whatever you want to call it. We're looking at the way it formed, what it represented, what type of covenant it is, and this is all to kind of seek out and understand Yahweh's justice, because that's what we're commanded to do. And so if we don't understand the terms of the covenant, we don't understand what we're expected to do or what we're expected to embrace with regards to this covenant, then how can we understand how we're going to be judged at the end? And then that, of course, the judgment falls into understanding Yahweh's justice. So today we're going to be looking at the ancient Near East prior to Moses, and this is to really just kind of get an understanding of the prologue of the Mosaic Sinai covenant. And so by understanding the conditions before the formation of this covenant, it should help us to understand the differences between the Sinai covenant and what was kind of the standard worship practices in the ancient Near East. So like the previous videos, this is primarily coming from the Ancient Israel's Faith and History by George Mendenhall. It's a favorite book of mine as far as the things that are in it. This is definitely a book that once you more or less kind of embrace some of the teachings in this book, then you begin to understand some of the things that Peter says in the Clementine recognitions or the Nazarene Acts. Some of the things that Peter says, it takes on a new meaning, like a deeper understanding. It's kind of like when I read the Nazarene Acts and then started looking into the documentary hypothesis, the JEPD sources of the Bible. There's things that the JEPD hypothesis explained that actually lined up with what Peter said, and it gave me a new understanding of what Peter was saying. And I think that by understanding some of the things that Professor Mendenhall speaks about, we can also add to that understanding. This is not meant to be a presentation about memorizing facts. This is about developing an understanding of the culture, and then through that understanding, then things should start jumping out of the text at you, or making more sense to you, and maybe in a different respect. So, like we discussed in the last couple of videos, there are some stages that religion goes through in the whole development process. First is the prologue to the religion. So that's what we're looking at today. The history of culture and society in the days prior to the appearance of a new religion. So this presentation is not going to have as much to do with Moses or the commandments, but it has more to do with what was the cultural conditions in the ancient Near East at that time. So Professor Mendenhall starts, and this is chapter 1 of the book, so I'll put a link in the description where you can download a PDF of the book, or you can always purchase it on Amazon, as I've mentioned before. So Professor Mendenhall in chapter 1, he starts off by saying, "It is a curious fact that Exodus is not the first book of the Bible. Biblical scholars today acknowledge that Hebrew religion, the worship of the God Yahweh, appeared relatively late in the history of the ancient Near East. Numerous hymns, prayers, and prophetic oracles throughout the Bible poetically describe how a group of Hebrews led by Moses escaped slavery in Egypt and shortly thereafter became constituted at Mount Sinai as the people of Yahweh. The prose narrative account of these formative events is found in the book of Exodus. Yet, the Bible begins not with Exodus, but with the book of Genesis, which tells of persons and events prior to the formation of this religious community. The placement of Genesis at the beginning of the biblical canon seems paradoxical until we view it as testimony to the Hebrews' own recognition that their cultural roots were older than their religion. Consequently, our study of the religion of ancient Israel must begin by examining this larger Near Eastern cultural background. This background serves as a prologue to the emergence of the biblical tradition. Fortunately, we have an abundant textual and artifactual evidence from the Near East prior to 1200 BC, which Dr. Mendenhall believes is the approximate date of Moses and the Exodus. I would personally, for my own chronological studies, I would move it back a little bit further to around the 1500s BC or late 1400s. And need not rely solely on traditions of Genesis for that background. Although abundant, this ancient evidence is also incomplete, limited by the accidents of historical discovery and by the momentary interest that prompted ancient people in the first place to record things in writing, always reflecting their own limited perspectives, biases, and conventions. The challenge is to piece this data together in such a way as to catch a glimpse into this ever-elusive past. So there are 5 ancient phenomenon that are crucial to a well-balanced understanding of the Bible's background. The first is the Amorite culture. Most people have never heard of the Amorites, although many scholars have written a great deal about them and the connections between their culture and the Bible. By the time biblical Israel emerged, archaic elements of Amorite culture were spread across the Near East, leaving their mark in varying degrees on almost every culture in the lands of the Bible, including that of the Israelites. So one thing in particular, for instance, that really plays into this understanding is that the Amorites were kind of the basis for the type of law system that was in the ancient Near East during the time period we're looking at. So the Amorites passed that on to the Hittites and to the Babylonians and even to the Egyptians. And so when we talk about looking at the book of Exodus or the book of Deuteronomy in light of ancient Near Eastern treaties, some of those elements in the treaties originated with the Amorite culture. And the Hebrews did not just appear in a vacuum. Like they themselves were the product of that same culture that used a certain type of legal system. And so by understanding other examples of the format in which these books were put into print, or not into print, but written down, then we can maybe understand a little bit more about the covenant, details and traditions and understandings that have been lost over time. Number 2, pagan religion and social control. So personally, I think this is one of the most interesting topics we're going to discuss in this video, and we're going to discuss it quite a bit later on in the video. But just as the introduction, while ancient governments, kings, bureaucrats, armies, judges, and courtrooms are intelligible to most of us, their integration of religion and politics seems strange, at least to those of us raised on the separation of church and state. By the time ancient people began to develop writing, the religion attested in these texts had apparently lost whatever autonomy it may have once enjoyed and had become essentially an arm of political control. Some gods symbolized the state or empires, while others symbolize the various social, political, and economic interests of different segments and subcultures of society. So like many people today, many ancient Near Easterners seem to have had a difficult time conceiving of religion apart from social enforcement system. We label as paganism this tendency to assume not only that the chief concern of deity is to compel obedience, but also that the chief instruments for this are the powerful institutions of control in society. In other words, the social application of coercive force was considered to be the typical concerns of the gods. And so likewise, you see that a lot of the kings and ruling class used the religion for their own political power. And of course, we see that even to this day in some respects. Number 3, social disintegration and collapse. There's been a prevailing tendency among scholars to explain the destruction of major social organizations in terms of external forces, such as invading armies. Social organizations also become vulnerable to collapse and destruction from internal processes, such as the disintegration of loyalties into competing factions within the organization. When this occurred, there is evidence of immigrants and refugees fleeing from economically unstable and increasingly violent trouble spots. Although often downplayed or ignored by most biblical scholars, this phenomenon contributed to the historical process out of which Israelite community and religion emerged. And so Mr. Mendenhall in his book, he mentions quite a bit that there was a mysterious destruction all across the ancient Near East at about the same time that he places the Israelite exodus out of Egypt. And he believes that it was caused by warfare. If you've been with me for a while and you were around when I was doing the series on the alternative history, when I talked a lot about Emanuel Velikovsky and his work, Mr. Velikovsky believed that the cause of this destruction was the conditions of the Exodus itself. That the Exodus is not the way you would see it portrayed in movies, where the Israelites are just walking out of Egypt and it's a beautiful sunshiny day. Mr. Velikovsky presented evidence that it was actually a regional, perhaps even worldwide disaster that occurred at the time of the Exodus. Hurricane-force winds, earthquakes, thunderbolts, just a very chaotic and terrifying type of natural phenomenon going on. That natural phenomenon was what caused the plagues, and so when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt, it would have been like coming out after a nuclear bomb that went off or something. And so I've got a playlist of those videos. If you haven't seen them, just go into the playlist on my channel, and you should find it there, about history's alternative timeline. Number 4, village life. Historians understandably focus on the affairs of the major urban centers of political and economic power and the elites there who produce written records. Unfortunately, the agricultural village has been largely ignored and sometimes even disparaged by historians. Even though this is where, year in and year out, the economic staples of everyone's existence, food and clothing and textiles, were produced. This is also where 80% of the people were born, raised families, struggled with daily hardships and paid taxes, tried to enjoy the simple pleasures of life, and died. Not only in the ancient Near East, but almost everywhere. The village was also the locus of cultural continuity in which one could find vestiges of older ways of life, including simpler technologies, more archaic social patterns, and older ways of thought. I would say that's even true today. If you have spent some time in the city, you can see that cities are our country's been going through a lot of changes in the last 40 years, going from what I would have termed back in maybe the 70s or in the 60s as a more godly country, and then over time, which of course is, I guess, more than 40 years, but it's kind of been on this decline into a state that is barely recognizable from what it was just a few decades ago. But if you go to the smaller towns, you see that older American way of life is still much more intact than it is in the cities. The city life is very different than the small towns. So if you want to see what America used to be like, you'll get a better picture of that by going to these smaller towns. And it's the same as in the ancient Near East. The cities were the places where political power was, where the changes that were instituted by those in power would take place, but the villages would more or less remain unchanged. As long as they paid their tribute or their taxes, they were more or less left alone. Number 5, ethnic diversity. A century ago, Western scholars interpreted most biblical references to Edomites, Assyrians, and Hebrews and so forth as references to discrete ethnic groups, an interpretation reinforced by the then current beliefs that each was originally a distinctive tribe or group of desert nomads. This was also reinforced by numerous biblical passages depicting each group as having a single, literal, biological ancestor. For instance, Esau is presented as the father of all Edomites. It is widely conceded today that references to common ancestors were almost always fictive and symbolic, not literal or biological. It now seems preferable to view these biblical references instead as the names of political regimes and social organizations whose members could, in fact, be quite diverse ethnically. So, on one hand, I see the point that Professor Mendenhall is trying to make. I don't really think that these traditions are fictitious. I think that, for instance, if Esau is being credited as the progenitor of the Edomites, well, Edom mixed in with some of the other local groups there, and like the Canaanites and the Hittites. That doesn't mean that every single Hittite was descended from Esau, but over time, with intermarriage and the spreading of Esau's genes through that gene pool, if they weren't all descended from Esau, a large portion of them probably did have an actual biological descent back to Esau. So I wouldn't say that it's fictitious, but Peter in the Nazarene Acts, he questioned whether Jacob really had 4 wives and the 12 sons, and so this would go a little ways toward maybe explaining some of that Jacob actually only had 1 wife, and he may not have had 12 sons, or maybe he did, but it would explain Peter's hesitance in believing that maybe these tribes, and this is the point that Professor Mendenhall makes later on, is that when a new group of people was brought into the covenant and they were labeled a tribe, like the tribe of Zebulun, that then the scribes would go back and change the history and add another son to Jacob to be able to explain why now there's this tribe of Zebulun. And so it's kind of like rewriting the history and creating this narrative to include these outerlying tribes into the federation of Israel. So that's going to take a little bit more of like a mindset change, but like I said earlier, some of the things that Mendenhall talks about, if you understand that maybe the tribes, instead of understanding the tribes as being all the descendants of a particular person, and instead think of them more as like a political entity. So this group converts to the faith of Israel, and they themselves make up a tribe. So it's more like a political designation, like you might refer to one of the states in the United States, or a region of a country with regards to another country. Rather than an amalgam of discrete ethnic groups, each associated with a distinct geographical center or homeland. The Near East was an ethnic melting pot in the centuries prior to Moses. Even the word Hebrew did not originally designate an ethnic group. And the evidence is sufficiently strong today to suggest that the Jewish concern for ethnicity appeared only a few centuries before the time of Christ. Perhaps most radical of all its evidence, discussed in chapters 2 and 3, suggesting that the Israelites themselves originally comprised a mix of people from different ethnic backgrounds. If true, the conventional picture of Yahwism as the religion peculiar to a distinctive ethnic group will have to be radically revised. So when Moses and the Israelites came out of Egypt, we're told that there was a mixed multitude of people. And in one of the previous videos, we looked at how it appears that the number of Israelites that came out, which is generally thought of as around 2 or 3 million, was probably more like 50 or 60,000, and that would include the mixed multitude. So then if perhaps 30,000 of those people were actually descended from Jacob, and then that group that came out of Egypt, if then they went into the Promised Land, and whereas the book of Joshua describes the Israelites coming in and wiping out vast numbers of people, Professor Mendenhall and other scholars believe that a large part of the book of Joshua was really just political propaganda written at the time of Solomon, and that the book of Judges is a more historical reflection of the culture at that time. And so there wasn't a great war where there was a massive genocide of people when the Israelites came into Israel. It was more of these tribes, these 50,000 or so people settling into the smaller towns, converting people, getting people to join the covenant in the same way that Yeshua sent out apostles to convert people to the covenant, and that's how the nation of Israel grew. It wasn't through a mass genocide. It was through mass conversions of the villages and the smaller tribal units that were already in Palestine. Historians refer to the pre-Israelite era as the Bronze Age. The recurring and massive disruptions of civilization in the Near East during that time are used to subdivide it into early, middle, and late periods, each of which can be further subdivided into discrete phases. Inspired largely by 19th century Romantic writings about the Arab Bedouin, most historians throughout the 20th century believed that these major cultural disruptions were the work of outside forces, specifically masses of land-hungry, Semitic-speaking nomads sweeping out of the Arabian desert and overwhelming these civilizations. According to this theory, the Israelites were one such group, invading Palestine around 1200 BC and overrunning Canaanite civilization. Although it has been largely dismissed by most scholars, this theory still manages to capture the imagination of popular audiences and some scholars. And so what Dr. Mendenhall is saying is that these theories that were prevalent in the late 19th and early 20th century have more or less been proven not to be the case. It wasn't a mass movement of nomads coming through that destroyed civilization. And they still don't really, I don't think, have a good explanation for it. I think, personally, the best explanation is it was the Exodus itself, like I mentioned earlier. It was the massive upheaval caused by forces of nature during the Exodus, and not invading armies or nomads sweeping across the land. The characteristic features of both Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations arose during the early Bronze Age, the time of the Great Pyramids of Egypt and the powerful Sumerian city-states of southern Mesopotamia. We know comparatively little about Palestine at this time, however, because we have unearthed no text dating from this period. So we know a lot about Egypt, but we know very little about Palestine during this period. It was not until the third phase of the early Bronze Age, which was 2650 to 2300 BC, that large fortified cities first began to be built in Palestine, many covering areas of 25 to 50 acres in size with defensive walls 25 to 30 feet thick. Between 2300 and 2100 BC, these large fortified cities of Palestine fell into ruin for reasons that remain a mystery. One after another was destroyed or simply abandoned. It is estimated that during this period, the population of Palestine dropped 65 to 85%. So at this point, Dr. Mendenhall goes into a lengthy explanation as to why the nomads and semi-nomad theories about the Israelites are not historically accurate. I'm going to skip this section. You can download the book and read it in chapter 1 if you would like to hear it. So the destruction or collapse of a civilization is often followed by several centuries when there is almost no writing at all, because everyone is struggling daily simply to secure the basic necessities of life. This is what historians call a dark age. When a bureaucracy reemerges and official writing resumes, the new class of professional scribes bases its writing system not on the outdated and perhaps even unintelligible language of centuries past, but the common vernacular spoken at the time. The person unaware of historical linguistics might mistakenly attribute changes of this magnitude to some new foreign group invading, destroying, and replacing the old native one. The new regime inevitably became as conservative linguistically as its predecessor. So once again, over time, the gap would widen between the official language of the elite and the grassroots dialect of the common folk. Because local factors can explain such linguistic change, there is no need necessarily to attribute it to foreign invaders, much less marauding nomads. Consequently, biblical scholars no longer have a solid basis for depicting the early Israelites as nomads or semi-nomads. And I'm including this because I think it's interesting what it's saying about the language, that maybe some of the language that we have in these historical documents don't even reflect the common vernacular of the day, that these scribes create this kind of aristocracy, and I mean, let's be honest, it kind of falls into job security when, in order to hold this position as a scribe, you have to speak this archaic language that the common people don't even understand anymore. However, we do have evidence of two notable population movements around the end of the early Bronze Age, labeled EB4, neither of which are instances of nomadism. The first involves Palestine proper. We noted previously that although the collapse of the large early Bronze 1H settlements decimated the population, there was apparently a population increase between 2300 and 2100 BC. Further south, the more arid Negev and Sinai wilderness regions, it seems reasonable to conclude that these people relocated here because this was one of the few places of refuge from the violence and chaos associated with the collapse of urban political civilization. The second notable population movement involved North Syria. Earlier, we noted the large number of early Bronze Age village ruins north of the 10-inch rainfall line and the large tracts of grazing land in the steppes south of it. This area, called Amorite, or the West, by the Mesopotamians, could sustain a relatively dense population. And indeed, there is evidence of increasing population density in the region between 2500 and 2300 BC. For example, the site of Tel Lian grew from 37 acres to 247 acres, suggesting a population increase from 4,000 to 25,000. We may infer that in time, social fissioning follows such an increase in population density, creating tensions among the people of Habiru. The Bible calls those people Amorites. Many biblical scholars today correlate the stories of Abraham's migrations in Genesis 12 with just such a southwardly immigration of Amorites. By 1800 BC, many Amorite families had accommodated themselves to urban culture, amassed wealth and influence, and become power brokers in the politics of the Near East. One noteworthy Amorite kingdom of the Middle Bronze Age was Mari, located on the Euphrates River near the modern borders of Syria and Iraq. Archaeologists have unearthed archives there containing more than 25,000 tablets, including many letters revealing features of Amorite culture and society that may have been carried southwest by immigrants whose descendants centuries later constituted a major component in Israelite society. Their Amorite legacy is still evident in vast portions of the Old Testament. So in other words, by comparing these clay tablets with some of the stories in the Tanakh, you can see that influence of the Amorite legacy there. Most scholars believe that some Canaanite myths and epics recounted in the late Bronze Age text from Ugarit are actually originated several centuries earlier in the Middle Bronze Age, when they circulated orally? If so, then the Middle Bronze Age appears to have been a sort of Canaanite heroic age, the term applied by the great Sumeriologist S.N. Kramer to periods in a society's history when royal courts would host a variety of festivities for visiting ambassadors, trade delegations, and other dignitaries, at which professional singers would recite epic tales about ancient heroes and royal ancestors. Among the Middle Bronze Age ballads recited at the royal festivities of Ugarit were those recounting the exploits of epic characters such as Karet and Daniel, both of whom were royal figures imperiled by lack of an heir. In this respect, they resemble the biblical Abraham, a man likewise childless, but destined to sire a royal dynasty. The original form of his name, Abram, is clearly Amorite, leading many scholars to speculate that, along with his kinsmen and livestock, he may have been an actual historical person who joined the southwesterly migration toward the land of Canaan. If he became a locally renowned figure, he too may have become the subject of some Middle Bronze Age oral ballad centuries before Israelite scribes transformed it into the stories now found in the book of Genesis. So I think the takeaway from this is that the migration of Abraham from Ur down into Palestine actually follows similar historical migrations of Amorites coming into the Promised Land. Until recently, the Hittites were little more than names in the Bible, but we can now reconstruct a fairly detailed history of their civilization. The Hittite capital at Bogaz Koi in central Anatolia has been excavated, and important Hittite archives have been uncovered containing several dozen treaties that will be discussed in the next chapter. Around 1350 BC, the Hittite king Suppilumash I conquered the Mitanni capital and annexed their territory. The Hittites also gained control of some smaller kingdoms that had previously been under Egyptian control, including Ugarit and Amorite, setting the stage for a clash of the Egyptian and Hittite superpowers. Reading a separate book on the Hittites right now, and I'm kind of amazed at how large of an area that their empire covered, all the way from Anatolia down into like Babylon and into Palestine. It's just a tremendous area that they influenced and that they controlled at one point. A cache of 380 tablets discovered in the archives at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, where the heretical king Amenephis IV, or Akhenaten, established his capital. It illuminates the situation of some of the smaller states caught up in this clash of superpowers. Most were letters written by various kings to Akhenaten and his predecessor Amenephis III, informing them of urgent matters affecting their respective kingdoms. One such kingdom was that of Amorite, located around Kadesh. As its name suggests, the ruling regime there traced its ancestry to the Amorites of North Syria, even though by this time its population was as ethnically diverse as the rest of the region. These El Amarna texts are also mentioned by Velikovsky as part of the information and the evidence that he used to prove his theories about the Exodus and the disaster that it was regionally. The letters of a dozen of these kings, written in cuneiform, mention hostile forces called Habiru. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, historians mistakenly imagined that these Habiru to be nomadic invaders. Some even went so far as to equate their activities with the supposedly nomadic Israelites' invasion of Canaan. But cuneiform texts all across the Near East refer to the Habiru as early as the Middle Bronze Age, making it unlikely that this is the name of a single distinct ethnic group. Egyptian texts call them Apiru, representing the actual Semitic consonants of the word more accurately than the cuneiform rendering. There is little doubt that the root of this word is identical to Hebrew Ibri, to cross over, especially to pass beyond some sort of established boundary. The word would therefore mean something like transgressor. In the ancient Near East, the word Habiru or Aparu was apparently a label disparaging anyone who, for whatever reason, no longer identified with or belonged to any of the established politically defined social organizations. Such a person became Aparu, that is, a transgressor or outlaw, who no longer considered part of the established social and political order. So, Aparu, from what Dr. Mendelsohn is saying, is he sounds like some type of a lone wolf, a right-wing conspiracy theory, patriot nut job type. The same labels that our modern government would use to label anyone who tries to live outside the reach of the large political establishment. They're generally demonized as a wicked person, but in reality, it's just someone that wants to be left alone and make their own way, not have the government controlling them. And so, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And so now you can see this reflected here in this piece of history. I think this may also explain why a lot of people who get into studying the Bible and want to live on biblical principles, they end up taking on a lot of this same type of behavior, like the more off the grid kind of person who wants to live outside of the reliance upon the government, for instance. Such detachment seems to be a constant in human history, an inevitable consequence of large-scale social organizations such as state governments, whose activities and policies always seem irrational or tyrannical to at least some of their own members. For example, as early as the Code of Hammurabi, the Babylonians had to deal with such persons who said, "I hate my king and my city," in effect renouncing their citizenship. Like many other ancient Near Eastern documents, the Amarna letters allude to such Aparu groups. Obviously, they further frustrated the already beleaguered kings of Canaan, and Aparu ranks may have swollen as the Canaanite power struggles, which many common folk probably wanted no part of, raged on. So, if the word Hebrew, originally meant someone who's kind of a stateless person, someone who's like an outlaw on the run or whatnot, we should be able to see that reflected in some of the earlier texts of the Bible. And so if we go to 1 Samuel, it says some biblical passages describing events in 11th century BC Palestine use the word Ibri exactly as the word Aparu was used there 3 centuries earlier. 1 Samuel 14:20, then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into the battle. And behold, every Philistine sword was against his fellow, and there was a very great confusion. Now the Ibri, who had been with the Philistines before that time, and who had gone up with them into the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. The Ibri here were people who identified themselves with neither Israelite nor Philistine society, and consequently had no formal place within either. The term, which is usually translated Hebrews, refers to their social and political status as outsiders, not to their ethnicity as Israelites. Also, 1 Samuel 29:2, as David and his men were passing on in the rear of the military column with Achish, the commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Ibri doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years, and since he deserted to me, have found no fault in him to this day?" It is noteworthy that the Philistines, in essence, labeled David and his followers as Aparu, not Israelites. The biblical tradition here recalls that the Philistine commanders were acutely aware of David's ambiguous social status. He was not a full-fledged member of Philistine society, yet he had deserted Israelite society and was now an outlaw, being hunted down by the Israelite king Saul. So, Of course, today the term Hebrew is generally associated with Israelite, like they're the same word. But originally, the word really meant something more like an outlaw or a stateless person. Although many scholars dispute this, there are sound linguistics and historical reasons for finding the word Habiru the origin and equivalent of the Hebrew term Ibri. Initially, the word Habiru or Hebrew was applied by their enemies to the early Israelites, who likewise did not identify with or belong to any established, politically defined social system. So this is the way that a lot of titles get applied to people. It starts out being applied as as maybe like an offensive title, or like like a denigrating way of referring to someone, and then eventually it kind of sticks as the name of the group. And I think that's what may have happened with this word Hebrew. In the eyes of others, the early Yahweh worshippers were Habiru Hebrews in the old and familiar sense of the word. They were alienated persons who refused to extend their loyalty to any of the existing political regimes or nations of the time. Centuries later, when these Yahweh worshippers had established their own political state, the archaic word Habiru or Hebrew would be forced to take on a new meaning, no longer disparaging social labels, roughly equivalent to outlaw, but eventually a respectable ethnic label virtually synonymous with, and he says Jew, I would say Israelite there. The king of Jerusalem during the Amarna age was Abdu-Hepa, whose name indicates his Hurrian ancestry. Hepa was a Hurrian goddess. From his Amarna letters, we learn that he was not originally a politician, but a soldier owing his royal position to Pharaoh's benevolence. The language of his letters indicate that Abdu-Hepa's scribe had come from either North Syria or southern Turkey. If the scribe had come to Jerusalem as part of Abdu-Hepa's entourage, it would reinforce the conclusion that Abdu-Hepa was a former Matami Marianu, now established as some sort of king or governor, protecting Egyptian interests in and around Jerusalem. There is also evidence of at least one other group of northern transplants in the Jerusalem area. In his letters, Abdu-Hepa refers to Kashites, who had previously attempted to assassinate him in Jerusalem. The Kashites were unknown until Hittite sources were discovered, revealing that Kashites originally inhabited the territory between the Hittite and Hurrian empires, probably along the Euphrates River in what is now south-central Turkey. During the New Kingdom period, the Egyptians apparently defeated and captured Hurrian and Kashite military units, resettling elements of both groups in the environs of Jerusalem, where old animosities resurfaced in political violence. These references to the Kashia may also help clarify a much-discussed biblical passage pertaining to Moses' wife, where it says, "And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian," which is Hebrew Kisi, woman, whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian or Kisi woman. Numbers 12:1. In other passages, Moses' wife Zipporah is said to have been a Midianite, and there is archaeological and linguistic evidence that, like Abdu-Hepa, some Midianites originated in the area of North Syria, southern Turkey. But what do we make of the word Kisi? Given what we now know, it seems that Zipporah must have been a Kashite whose ancestors had immigrated from south-central Turkey, along with others who subsequently formed Midianite confederation of tribes. Traditionally, however, Kisi has been interpreted as Cushite, the Egyptian name for the Nubians of Ethiopia. This inspired a much later tradition that Moses had married a black woman, but the evidence now clearly indicates that Moses' wife was not Ethiopian. So this is another one of those examples that we've mentioned in previous presentations where the meaning of a word changed, or there was a word that they didn't quite understand the meaning of, and so like a new meaning was applied to it. So this is meant to have indicated that Moses' wife Zipporah was one of these people identified as the Kashites or the Kashia. And because there wasn't knowledge of who these Kashia were, and of course Hebrew doesn't have vowels, so they had to do the best they could with the consonants, and they ended up believing that she was a Cushite, when in reality she was a Kashite, which is a similar name. And so it's not that Moses had two wives, one Zipporah and then this Cushite. Both of these terms, Midianite and Kashia, would have referred to Zipporah. So Moses didn't have two wives, he just had the one. Because religion and politics were so closely intertwined in the late Bronze Age, the Habiru rejection of a politically defined social organization likely entailed the rejection of the religious systems and values that undergird it, and vice versa. Okay, so this is where we're getting into now, speaking about the pagan cultures in the late Bronze Age. So what I just read is basically saying that the Habiru, if they're rejecting the political establishment, they also reject the gods that go along with it, and vice versa. The late Bronze Age witnessed an increasing concentration of wealth and power, ironically at the expense of the village population who produced the goods and services necessary for any political organization in the first place. The acquisition of wealth and power seems in fact to have been the dominant value in this period, religiously personified and deified in such gods as Baal and Ashtoreth. Statues of Baal were everywhere, and they apparently served as deified symbols of power. So, if you had a statue of Baal, Baal represented the power of the king of whatever political establishment was in power there. And it would be the same as it's almost like a political symbol of some sort. So it's like a deified symbol of power or symbol of the king. And Professor Mendenhall makes a very interesting statement. He says a more contemporary functional equivalent may be the upraised clenched fist that adorned the banners, bumper stickers, and letterheads of various political movements of the 1960s and 70s. And of course, we see the same symbology now being resurrected in the 2020s with groups like the ones that are pictured above. Ironically enough, or maybe it's not ironically enough, but the behind the scenes information that you're not supposed to know is that all of these groups pictured above are all controlled by the same tribe. The tribe who is the subject of the videos on who is Esau Edom. So you would think Black Lives Matter is a black organization. It's not. It's created and controlled at the top by those of the tribe of Esau Edom, as is the communism itself is, again, a product of Esau Edom. And the Jewish Defense League is controlled by Edomite Jews. So again, it's all the same tribe controlling all of these, and you could very accurately view this clenched fist as a modern symbol of Baal. It's a symbol of power, which is what Baal is. So this reminds me of there's a World's Fair from Chicago in the early 1900s, and there's videos of this where several hundred Jews are dancing and parading around in front of this giant statue of Baal, and reading this in this book, and then putting it together with this video that I've watched several times about the Baal worship at this early World's Fair. I think it was around 1910 or 1914, something like that. There's videos on the internet. It's pretty easy to find. Just type in Chicago World's Fair Baal, Baal, dancing, and you should be able to find it on YouTube or Rumble. He goes on to say, understanding ancient religion becomes much easier once we realize that deities such as this and their symbols and rituals were merely state-sanctioned expressions of entrenched social values. In other words, A social value does not initially receive its impetus or derive its legitimacy because religion espouses it. From the outset, its legitimacy is unquestioned, and the fact that it is considered legitimate and authoritative induces people to represent it symbolically in religious forms and terms, even to the point of personifying it as a god. For example, Asherah was one of the 3 Canaanite goddesses, usually referred to as fertility goddesses. But to call them that misses the point. They were personified productivity, not fertility. To worship Asherah was to celebrate wealth and prosperity. At the same time, indulging in luxurious lifestyle was just as much worship as offering prayers and sacrifices at one of her shrines. Thus, the worship of Asherah, in a sense, remains alive and well even in contemporary America. Advertising encourages it all the time. The driving religious ideology of people is often manifested and more clearly and candidly in their characteristic behavior and choices than in their formal rituals, doctrines, and myths. So, worshiping the state is essentially worshiping Baal. Worshiping productivity, the god of mammon type of statement. The god of mammon is actually a goddess. It's Asherah. And so if you are conducting your life centered around the acquisition of mammon, that is as much worshiping Asherah as literal worshiping of Asherah. So in the same way, murdering unborn children would itself be an act of worship toward Moloch. And that's why you see organizations like Planned Parenthood, which is, again, a Jewish organization, has the symbology of Moloch. Their symbol is the owl. In fact, the Planned Parenthood logo is the stylized right side of a horned owl's face. So there's a reason for that, because it's disguised pagan worship brought about by the synagogue of Satan. Baal personified power, overwhelming any enemy who threatened the status quo. To worship him was to celebrate power, which was highly valued in the late Bronze Age, and to extol the role of that coercive force plays in human affairs. To describe Baal worship as the veneration of power is to recognize it as a universal phenomenon that can neither be localized in one part of the world nor limited to one particular historical era or characteristic of one particular culture. Likewise, its presence need not be restricted to formal liturgies invoking the name of Baal. The Canaanite theology of Baal frankly conceded that power is worshipped under many names, and that even though Baal inevitably dies, in time he springs back to life again. This is the nature of power and the systems devoted to it. When Israelites later came to value their own social exercise of political power, they began to regard their God, Yahweh, as if he were Baal. And now you understand some of the passages from the prophets extolling the Israelites to practice righteousness and justice, and saying that they have forgotten the name of Yahweh for the name Baal, that they've been calling Yahweh by the name Baal. And it's because they have converted the true worship of Yahweh into something very similar to this late Bronze Age practice of worshiping power or worshiping the state under this banner or this symbol of Baal. For modern Western audiences, this theology of power is probably articulated more intelligently and succinctly in the 5th century BC reply of the Athenians to the Milos delegation than in the 14th century BC Ugaritic myth of Baal. The Athenians had forcibly seized the small island of Melos, whose delegates pleaded that it was wrong of Athens to dominate them in this way. The historian Thucydides contrasted the dignity of the millions with the rapacity of the Athenians, who addressed the millions as follows. So this is the message from the Athenians. Of the gods we believe, and of human beings we know, that there is a natural imperative for them to extend their rule whenever they can. We are not the first people to invent this principle, nor are we the first ever to act upon it. It existed long before us, and it will exist long after we're gone. We are merely acting upon this imperative, knowing that you and everyone else would do exactly what we are doing if you had the same measure of power as we. The Athenians were not interested in right or wrong. For them, morality was secondary to interest to power. Everyone knows that justice is relevant only among those who are equal in power, while the strong take whatever they can, and the weak concede whatever they must. For the Athenians, this was a natural imperative. The Canaanites called it the worship of Baal. Nowadays, among other things, we call it national self-interest. Almost all ancient literary and artistic sources clearly and consistently illustrate this deification of power. Although power was recognized in and identified with many forms, such as the storm, the hunt, the battle, the clearest and most common form in which it was extolled was always kingship, the exercise of political authority. It should come as no surprise that from Greece to India, the most common theme of ancient myth has characteristically involved the conflict between competing political powers. So if you look at some of these ancient artwork carved into pyramids and other ancient ruins, where it shows a king going into battle, and above the king you'll see like a sun. That sun is the symbol of Baal. So the king is going into battle, and Baal, represented by the sun, is following him into battle, or leading him into battle. And the reason is they believe that the king was like the representative of Baal on earth. And so when the king went out to battle, he was battling in the power of Baal. So, and again, this is, as Dr. Mendenhall says, it's the clearest and most common form in which it was extolled was kingship. So the king was the direct representative of power, of Baal, and so when the king went to battle, Baal, he was just fulfilling the will of Baal. Again, Martin Luther once observed that your God is that which you most fear to lose. More recently, Paul Tillich identified a God as an ultimate concern. For the influential citizens and decision-makers of the late Bronze Age, the ultimate concerns they most feared losing were power and prosperity in the political apparatus that was believed to guarantee both. For the elite, these concerns took precedence over almost every other consideration. Like many modern folk, they found it impossible to conceive of the reality of the divine apart from some social system of coercion and force. To worship Baal and Asherah was to affirm the supreme value that power and wealth played in making all human life experience meaningful. Okay, so what's the purpose? What, I guess, is the takeaway from this presentation? And these are my words on the screen now. This is not Professor Mendenhall. I would say that understanding the values of the pagan systems in ancient Palestine prior to Sinai, perhaps now we will be able to fully appreciate how revolutionary the covenant with Yahweh was. It was a complete rejection of the political system and the worship used to legitimize it. The kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven as is presented in the New Testament, founded by Moses, was the rule of a people by God without a human king operating as an intermediary of God. So whereas these other political establishments would recognize their king as the personification of their God, in ancient Israel, prior to the kingship of Saul and David and Solomon, they literally believed that God was their king, and that any judge or any prophet who was operating within Judea was never the king themselves. So, of course, this is the period of the judges up until the anointing of Saul. And so when Yeshua sought to bring back the kingdom of heaven, and he would say the kingdom of heaven is at hand, that's what he was referring to, is he was attempting to reestablish the kingdom of heaven. And from what I can tell, it was essentially rejected, at least by the Judeans. And so then this kingdom of heaven itself, in a sense, it manifested in medieval Europe when the apostles went into Europe and presented this new faith to the remnants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. So when we speak about the kingdom of heaven, this is what we should have in mind. This rule by Yahweh, apart from this Baal worship of worshiping, the national interest of war and espionage. So I thank you for listening. I pray that this has been a blessing and it's given you a few things to think about. Like I've said, you can download a copy of this book. I highly recommend you do so. And just when you read this, don't think of it as memorizing a bunch of facts like you do in like a history class. Think of it as learning the way people thought, learning what these things represent, what these words in the Bible represent. And let's try and correct some of these misunderstandings, like what's the meaning of Hebrew? Well, now we know what it is. It's someone who has rejected the established political kingship system. And so, we're setting the stage now for the covenant at Sinai and what was groundbreaking and significant about that. So thank you for listening. Shalom.